I far preferred the lazy Sasha, Uncle Mikhail's son. He was a quiet boy with sad eyes and a pleasant smile, whom I didn't see much of, and who was the image of his sweet, gentle mother. He had ugly protruding teeth that grew in a double row in the upper jaw. This worried him a great deal, and he was perpetually fingering them and trying to pull out the back row. He would let anybody touch them. This was the only interesting thing about him. He lived alone in a house crammed from top to bottom with people. During the day he loved to sit in a dark corner, and in the evenings he moved over to the window. I liked to sit close to him, neither of us speaking, for a whole hour, and watching the black crows circling and wheeling in the red evening sky around the golden cupolas of the Church of the Assumption, diving down to earth and draping the fading sky with a black net. Then off they would fly, leaving utter emptiness. A scene like this fills the heart with sweet sadness and leaves you content to say nothing. On the other hand, Uncle Yakov's son, Uncle Yakov's Sasha, could discourse at length and with the authority of an adult. When he discovered I wanted to become a dyer, he told me to get the white tablecloth, which was used for special occasions, and dye it blue. White's always the easiest, and I should know, he said in a very serious tone. I pulled the tablecloth out, ran into the yard with it, but no sooner had I dropped it into the indigo tub than Siganuk pounced on me, hauled it out, squeezed it with his broad hands, and shouted to my cousin, who had followed me out of the house to supervise the work. "Call grandmother at once." He shook his black, disheveled hair ominously and said, "You'll cop it for this." Grandmother came running, groaned, even burst into tears, and started to scold me with quaint, comical expressions. "You no good, perm, blockhead. I've a good mind to drop you in one of those tubs." Then she began exhorting Siganuk. "Vanya, don't dare tell grandfather whatever you do. I won't say anything, and perhaps no one will find out." Vanya had said anxiously, wiping his wet hands on his many-colored apron. "It's nothing to do with me, but I won't say anything." "I'll keep him quiet with a few coppers," said grandmother as she led me into the house. On Saturday, just before evening prayer, someone took me into the kitchen, where it was dark and quiet. I clearly remember lots of doors shut tight, and beyond the windows the misty grayness of an autumn night and the dull sound of rain. On a broad bench in front of the black-mouthed stove sat my friend Siganuk, hardly recognizable. Grandfather stood in the corner by the sink, picking out long twigs from a bucket full of water. He measured them, bound them up, and made them whistle through the air. Somewhere in the darkness, grandmother noisily took her snuff and grumbled, "Leave him be, you butcher." Sasha Yakovov, who was sitting on a chair in the middle of the kitchen, rubbed his eyes with his fists and said in a drawling voice that sounded more like an old baker's than his own, "For Christ's sake, forgive him." Shoulder to shoulder like tree trunks, Uncle Mikhail's children, brother and sister, stood on the far side of the table. "I'll forgive him when I'm finished," said grandfather, laying a long wet twig across his hand. "Right, take your trousers off." He said this calmly, and neither the sound of his voice nor the noise of the children leaning on the creaky table, not even grandmother scraping her feet along the floor, broke that memorable silence in the gloomy kitchen beneath a smoke-blackened ceiling. Sasha got up, undid his trousers, let them down to his knees, and managed to keep them from falling right down with his hands. Bent double, he stumbled across to the bench. It wasn't a pleasant sight, and my legs shook in sympathy. But worse was to come. When he lay on the bench like a lamb for the slaughter, face downwards, with a wide towel Vanka tied him to it, round the armpits and neck, and then stooped over him and gripped his ankles with his black hands. "Come a bit closer, Alexei," grandfather said. "Did you hear me? Now you'll see what I mean by flogging." He swung his hand not very high and brought the twigs down hard on bare flesh. Sasha gave a piercing scream. "Liar," said grandfather. "That didn't hurt. Try this for size." He struck him again so violently that the skin became inflamed at once, and a red stripe appeared. My cousin howled continually. "Isn't that delightful?" grandfather inquired, raising and dropping his arm at regular intervals. "Don't you like it? It's in payment for the thimble." When he swung his arm up or down, my heart rose and fell exactly in time. Sasha screamed in a revolting, delicate little voice. "I won't do it again. I told you about it, didn't I? I confessed." Calmly, as though he were reading from the Psalms, Grandfather said, "Telling tales is no excuse. Informers should be punished first. That's for the tablecloth." Grandmother rushed towards me and seized me in her arms. She cried, "I won't let you take Alexei. I won't, you monster." She started kicking at the door and called out, "Varya! Varvara!" Grandfather fell upon her, knocked her off her feet, snatched me away from her, and carried me off to the bench. I struggled, pulled his red beard, and bit his finger. He roared, squeezed me, and finally threw me on the bench so that I cut my face open. I still remember his wild cry, "Tie him up, I'll kill him." And I remember, too, Mother's pale face with its enormous eyes. She ran the length of the bench gasping, "Papa, let him go. Please don't." Grandfather flogged me until I was unconscious, and for several days I was very ill. I lay in a wide, stuffy bed, face downwards in a little room with one window. In one corner, in front of a case crammed full of icons, burned an everlasting lamp. These days of sickness were very important for my future development, and during them I must have grown up a lot. I began to experience a totally new kind of feeling. From now onwards, my concern for others never let me rest for a moment, and just as if my heart had been laid bare, I became almost intolerably sensitive to any insult or physical pain, whether I or someone else was the victim. A quarrel between Mother and Grandmother made more impression on me at this time than anything else. There was Grandmother, looking huge and black in that cramped room, angrily pushing Mother into the corner where the icons were. "Why didn't you take him?" she hissed. I was frightened. "A healthy woman like you? You should be ashamed of yourself. I'm an old woman and I wouldn't have been afraid. Shame on you." "Leave me alone, I feel sick." "You don't love him. He's an orphan and you don't feel any pity." Mother said in a loud, weary voice, "What about me? I'll be an orphan for the rest of my life." For a long time they sat crying on the chest in the corner. Mother said, "If it weren't for Alexei, I'd leave here. I can't live in this hell. I haven't the strength." "My own flesh and blood, my angel," whispered Grandmother. Mother wasn't very strong, and like everyone else was afraid of Grandfather. Because of me, she couldn't leave the house, where life was unbearable for her. It was all very depressing. But soon Mother did in fact disappear, and she went to stay with some friends. Suddenly, as if he jumped down from the ceiling, Grandfather appeared, sat on my bed, and felt my head with a hand as cold as ice. "Good morning, sir. Now answer me, and don't be angry. How are you?" All I wanted was to kick him, but the least movement was painful. His hair looked redder than ever before. He shook his head restlessly, and his bright eyes seemed to be looking for something on the wall. He took out of his pocket a piece of gingerbread, 2 sugar cakes, an apple, a little branch with blue raisins, and put them all on the pillow just by my nose. "Look, I brought you some presents." He leaned over and kissed me on the forehead. Then he started talking to me, stroking my head with his small, rough hands, covered all over in yellow dye, especially the deformed, bird-like nails. "I've been very hard with you, but you lost your temper. You bit and scratched me and made me lose mine. It won't hurt you if you got more than you deserved. I'll count it as part of payment for the future. You must remember that when someone of your own flesh and blood beats you, it's for your own good, and you should never consider it an injustice." "Do you think I was never thrashed? I got such beatings the like you've never seen, even in a nightmare. I was so badly treated that God would have wept to see it. And what good did it do me? I was an orphan with a beggar for a mother, and in spite of that I got where I am now, a free man, a member of the guild, a leader of men." He leaned up against me with his thin, finely built body, and began to tell me about his childhood in vigorous, meaty words, which he strung together with great skill and ease. His green eyes burst into bright flames, his reddish gold hair bristled as he deepened his voice and trumpeted right into my face. "So you came on a boat with steam to help it along. When I was your age, I fought against the Volca, pulling a barge which was in the water, and I had to struggle on my own along the bank, barefooted, walking over sharp stones and rocks right from dawn to dusk. The sun scorched the back of your neck, and your head seemed to boil like molten steel. And you, miserable wretch, bent double, your bones creaking, press on and on till you don't see where you're going anymore. You're blinded by sweat, and your soul weeps, and a tear rolls down your cheek. That was life. On and on you'd go, then tumble free from the hauling rope, flat on your mug and glad of it. Work like that sapped all your strength, and all you wanted was rest. That's how we lived, with Jesus Christ smiling down on us. I measured out Mother Volga from 3 times, from Simbirsk to Rimbisk, from Saratov to here, and from Askherhan to Markiyev, right to the fair. And that's a lot of miles. 4 years later I was a water pumper, and I soon showed my boss how smart I was. He talked very quickly and swelled like a cloud in front of me, changing from a small thin old man into someone of fabulous strength, just him against the river with his huge gray barge. Often he would jump from the bed and wave his hands about to show me how the barge haulers were harnessed with ropes, how they pumped water out. In a bass voice he sang to me. He then leapt on the bed like a young man, once more fascinating me with his racy, vigorous stories. And then Olyesha, when we got to a resting place on a summer evening in Ziguli, somewhere at the foot of a green hill, we'd light fires and heat up some cabbage soup. Then one of us, crossed in love perhaps, would sing a heart-rending song that made you go cold all over, and the Volga seemed to flow faster, just like a horse rearing up right into the clouds. And all our grief seemed like dust before the wind. We used to get so carried away that the pot would soon boil over and the cook would get it in the neck. Always keep your mind on the job, I say. Several times someone poked his head around the door and called grandfather, but I said imploringly, "Don't go." He would laugh and wave everyone away. I won't be long. He would go on telling his stories until the evening, and when he left, after an affectionate farewell, I realized grandfather was not wicked or terrifying, and then it was terribly hard for me to remember that he'd beaten me so cruelly. But all the same, I was never to forget it. Grandfather's visit opened the door to the whole household, and from morning till evening there was usually someone sitting by the bed doing all they could to amuse me. But their efforts weren't always successful. Grandmother was my most frequent visitor. She shared the same bed. But the one who left the most vivid impression on me was Siganuk, with his huge square shoulders, broad chest, and enormous curly head. He came to visit me one evening, gaily dressed as if he were off to a party, in a golden silky shirt, velvet trousers, and boots that squeaked like a harmonica. His hair shone, his squinting eyes sparkled merrily under his thick eyebrows, and his white teeth gleamed beneath the black stripe of his young mustache. His shirt, gently reflecting the red flame of the icon lamp, seemed to be on fire. "Just you look," he said, as he raised his sleeve to show me his arm, which was covered up to the elbow in red scars. "See how it's swollen? They've almost healed now. You should have seen them before. Like to know what happened? In comes your grandfather in a blind rage, and I see him start on you. So I put my arm between you and the whip, hoping it would break, so that grandfather would have to go and get another one, and your grandmother or mother could have dragged you to safety. But no, the twigs didn't break, as the water made them too supple. Even so, I saved you from some of the strokes. You can see from the scars how many. I can be really crafty when it comes to it." He broke into a silky laugh, looked again at his swollen arm, and said, still laughing, "You don't know how sorry I was for you. It fair choked me, but the way he lay about you with that whip." He snorted like a horse, tossed his head, and started saying something about grandfather that at once warmed me by its childlike simplicity. I told him I was very fond of him, and he gave me an answer I shall never forget. "But I'm very fond of you. Do you think I'd taken all that punishment if I wasn't? Do you think I'd have done that for anyone else? To hell with everyone else." He lowered his voice, looked every now and again at the door, and gave me the following lesson. "When you get another beating, mind you, don't tense your body, understand? It hurts twice as much if you do that. Relax, let your muscles go, so that you're all soft, like a piece of jelly. And don't hold your breath. Breathe out as hard as you can. Shout blue murder. Now remember what I'm telling you." I asked, "Will they flog me again?" "What do you think?" Siganuk said calmly. "Of course they will. Hundreds of times more." "But what for?" "Grandfather will find some excuse." Then, with an anxious look in his eyes, he continued the lesson. "When he brings the twig straight down, lie quiet and relax, but if he hits you sideways to tear the skin off, wriggle towards him and try to follow the direction of the birch. Then it's much easier to bear." Winking with his dark squinting eyes, he said, "I know more about this kind of thing than a policeman. You can make a pair of leather gloves with all the skin I've lost." I peered into his cheerful face and called to mind grandmother's stories of